Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Nick. This session is called Charting the Course from V2 to FHIR Messaging. There's a subtitle called Is It All Smooth Sailing? It's going to be sort of like nautical themed, but I quickly got into putting GIFs in my presentation and moved away from that. So if you're not supposed to be here or you didn't want to be here, feel free to leave. I won't be offended. There is sort of an interactive component at this URL. If you're like me, you learn by just writing code. So I won't be offended if you go to this URL and play with the open source HL7 V2 parser we have. And there's just some little examples in there. Very incomplete, but you can start to get a feel for some of these topics. A little bit about me. I'm from the States. I started my career in healthcare at Epic. It's a big EHR software company. I'm sure most of you in the Netherlands have probably heard of it. And if you've ever had your data sent over an interface on an Epic system, you've probably had my code handling your data. So may God help you. In 2014, I left, and I was employee number 2 at a company called Redox. I live in Pennsylvania. This is a picture of my dog. Her name is Wren, and I translated that to Dutch. It's a type of bird. So I think that's like Winter King, or something like that. It seems like a pretty cool name in Dutch, so might come up with a new nickname for her. So this talk is going to be kind of just a list of principles that I think you can apply when you're converting really any kind of data from one format to another, but specifically V2 to FHIR and FHIR to V2. The first principle I really want to have you guys take away from this, and especially if this is the one you want to see, is just start with the end in mind. So if you're mapping between two things, doing it once can be pretty straightforward, but scaling that to 100 and 1,000 can be really, really painful if you don't make some good decisions early on. You're going to have to make tough decisions if you have people to bounce those ideas off of, or you have sort of a set of principles and things you've written down. Sort of design work done can be easier, and it can be easier to fix problems when you've created them. You have a state to go back to. This is a never-ending loop here, so kind of trying to express that you should always look for the end. Sometimes it's not possible to find. So the reason I think I'm qualified to talk about this is Redox mostly taps into HL7 version 2. If especially in the United States, the state of the industry is that if you want to get real data today, or especially write data, you have to use HL7 version 2. Oftentimes, that's very difficult to do from an infrastructure perspective. You need to use a VPN. People really have not adopted TLS methods of exchanging V2. And we basically take HL7 version 2 feeds from over 300 health systems, so into the thousands of feeds, and sort of clean them up, map them to a canonical model, which we then convert into FHIR and other things. And we've learned a lot of lessons along the way. Sort of the other side of this are our partners. So these are the people who actually pay us to do this. Really the value we add to them is just cleaning that data, normalizing it, handling the infrastructure challenges. And in this talk, spoiler alert, I'm going to arrive as FHIR messaging is the right solution for some of these things. But that's really because we wanted a one-size-fits-all approach for them. So coding to each one of their APIs in addition to sort of cleaning up the data from health systems is pretty unsustainable. So FHIR messaging, just kind of push everything to one endpoint and they figure it out. But that's sort of the scope. By the way, feel free to stop me and ask questions at any time. Just a hand raise would be good. And yeah, if I'm speaking too slow or too fast, let me know as well. So I think you can fall into one of 4 buckets. I like to think that people sort of straddle these at all times. But I think in the world, there really are a lot V2 people who just know V2, and they are usually employed by health systems. and that's their life. But hopefully we have some of them that want to learn what FHIR is all about and sort of give people a modern interface to their, their bread and butter. I think there's also people who are really into FHIR, and they might be realizing some of those like sort of harsh realities about the way the industry is right now, where if you want to write data, like V2 is the way to go. So you want to figure out a way to gracefully transition and still use FHIR for all your developers and all the like nice features it has, but have an interface to do useful things. So principle number 2, I kind of want to start with this with the V2 to FHIR world. V2 is not just CSV. So a lot of people might look at a V2 message and say like, oh crap, this is just like a delimited format. I know this. There's actually a lot of modeling under the hood. And I think that what we've found is that, the more you dig into the modeling, you can start to build better tools off of. Think of structure definition in FHIR. It's like very, very well, very, very useful in describing everything about a resource. If you have sort of a really solid starting point in V2, you can start to do some similar things. And I think I've heard talk of FHIR profiling being applied to V2 at some point in the future. So something to look out for. So knowing the lay of the land, or at least knowing like which parts of the map are water and which parts are land, is important. Does everyone from Europe know this show? So I wanted to start with just a really simple kind of history lesson about HL7 version 2. This is the same field, and this would correspond to identifier on patient resource. The top one is from 1994. It's the earliest version of the HL7 version 2 spec you can download. And the bottom one is from 2.7, which is the most recent. Who can spot the differences in these two? Just shout them out. Yeah, strings. So some things, some data types changed. So the first component there started out as numeric and now as a string. There's a lot more components at the end. For assigning facility ID, it used to be a string. Now it's called assigning authority, and it's a HD data type. So the crazy thing about HL7 version 2 is that there's really a strong emphasis on backwards compatibility. So the thing that was defined up here in 1994 is still valid in this one. This is just a superset of that. So what that means in practice is that when you go into a HL7 version 2 interface and you see something, it might be asserting that it's a version like 2.7, but the actual like underlying data could much more closely resemble the 1994 version. If you ever feel the need to curse FHIR for breaking compatibility between versions, this is sort of the alternative, right? Where it's like, like everybody's compatible. You can process a message from 1994 just fine, but when you actually go to dig into the data, it's like a really mixed bag in terms of quality. So I'm for breaking compatibility and having solid versions. I'm sure many of you have clicked on the mappings tab in a FHIR resource. So this is a great place to get started if you're just sort of lost in the woods. There is like not a silver bullet for this, but you can kind of start to see how some of these examples would work. So we were looking at patient identifier. It comes from a field in HL7 version 2 called PID3. When you dig down into the data type and in the FHIR specs, there's also mappings for those. So you can see everything on this box here is mapped except for use. So there, theoretically, if someone's filling out all the fields in HL7 version 2, you can get a pretty good population of that identifier array. And if anybody's pulled up this example already, we can hop over here, and here's how I'm doing that mapping. So this is JavaScript. I have a function here that's just taking sort of the parsed version of that ADT message up there. I'm doing a really quick map on the PID3 field because it repeats, and returning an object literal. I'm just putting the use as usual because again we can't map that. And I'm pulling the coding, the system, the value, and assigner. You just kind of fudge it. It's a similar concept. I'm trying to restart my slideshow here. So identifiers work great. Some other things, there's not a great map between V2 and FHIR. So for contact point in V2, depending on where that data is, it's going to be a home phone number or a work phone number, for example. So you'll see the use. Down here it says XTN2, but it's often indicated by the field. So it could be conditional based on where the data is coming from. So again, you're writing like a pretty specific map there, and maybe doing some conditional logic when you're translating. And then when you get into things like providers, it's all over the map. So providers appear multiple times in HL7 version 2 messages. They're various levels of fidelity. Sometimes even within the same message, you'll see one field is populated one way and another one's populated another way, just because two different developers worked on it at the same time. I did that kind of work at Epic, so I know how it works. So again, you have to be a little more thoughtful, dig into the data a little more. So speaking of digging into the data, principle number 3 is DataQA. If you've never heard that term before, QA still means quality assurance, but especially if you're doing analytics and things like that, having the tools built into your pipeline where you can validate the data and be really confident that it's going to be not only clean and consistent, but not break anything, is really valuable as you start to scale. So there's this whole joke, when you've seen one V2 message, you've seen one V2 message. Has anyone ever heard that one? You can laugh. It's funny, but really when you've seen one, you've seen about 80% of them. It's not that severe. What we do and sort of what it really helps us scale is like we have built-in unit testing for each new sort of configuration we write. So every time a new system comes onto the network, we have sort of a base ADT map, and then sort of maybe like a base Epic or Cerner map, some things we just know that they do weird. And then that particular customer has some things configured that we'll go and figure out. We can put in sort of like assertions and say this should always be this way, and also put in assertions for data that we expect not to be there. So if something new gets added, we don't break existing downstream systems by sending additional data they're not expecting. Finally, I think that when data is missing, just having a plan. So again, I mentioned sort of designing things out. Taking the time to sit down and write out and say, hey, if we don't get an identifier ID type, what do we do? Do we invent one? Do we go back and say, hey, tell us what this is? Having sort of code that does that and enforces that, as well as a plan that humans would follow, is important. Cool. So still on the topic of V2 to FHIR, I want to talk about events, and I want to give a little quiz. So raise your hand if you think that REST only applies to HTTP. I guess pretty smart room here. So yeah, false, at least according to Wikipedia. The key things are statelessness. So when something is interacting with a RESTful resource, like it shouldn't have to know anything about that resource beforehand to actually like interact with it. And then there's a limited set of verbs. To me, these are sort of the key things. I think when you actually look at HL7 version 2, this is sort of me doing a LS on the chapters of HL7 version 2. I put X's on the ones that are not RESTful, but most are pretty RESTful. So observations, it's like pretty close to a FHIR observation in terms of the restfulness of the data. There's not a whole lot of verbs that interact with it, and sort of, if you receive an observation on HL7 version 2 message, you don't really need to know a lot about the state of it beforehand. You can just sort of accept it as it is. It's just like a put or a post. These three, especially patient administration, are very stateful. So patient administration, so-called ADT, sort of tracks a patient throughout the system. If you have a patient admitted to a hospital and you say transfer them and then discharge them, that doesn't work if you discharge them and then transfer them. So the order matters and the state on the other system matters quite a bit. So these things are very powerful as long as you can harness them. So I wanted to kind of dig into an example of the transfer. This is, of course, Ronaldo, a very notable transfer. A couple laughs, okay. So you typically would have an ADT system, something that's managing the state of all those patients in the hospital. But let's say I make an app that's just like a bed management app, and I want to know when somebody's moved out of a room so I can go change the bedding, sanitize some things. There's a lot of ways to do this, and I don't think anyone's actually done this. If you do make a bed state management app, let me know. But here's a few ways to do it. So the restful transfer, there's a couple ways to do that even. The source of truth is the encounter resource, okay? And it has a location array with timestamps for when a person was in a place. So we have a lot of programmers here. Raise your hand if you think you could write a little snippet of code that determines if a patient was transferred just from that array. Like, I think I could. I'm not very confident it would work, and I really don't trust the system sending it to me to populate these things all the time, or even two different systems. They might not send a status, they might not send like an end time or a start time, and then my whole logic just breaks. So it gets tricky. This is the source of truth, but it's sort of hard to get that event notification from it. There are other resources like a task where you could sort of say, hey, bed management app, go change the sheets, okay? That is restful, but it still implies a lot of coordination between you and the app. So you're not necessarily talking about the state of the patient, you're talking more about just a thing to be done. It maps more closely to the actual real world in some cases. But at the end of the day, there's finite resources, and you don't expect everyone to support tasks. You might, you wouldn't necessarily expect an EHR to know to create a task to change the bedding. They just care about telling you that someone is transferred. So operations in FHIR, those are useful things. Would anyone here think of using an operation first? Yeah, a couple hands. It's not a bad approach. I think of it as like a function defined on a resource. In this case, you might define that function on the location. So the bed resource, you just call, transfer complete or something like that, or change bedding. It can be whatever you want. And sort of the system receiving that operation knows what to do. They have that event set up. One of the nice things is that it's in their capability statement, so you know if they support it or not. And yeah, you can just sort of really specify, drill down to that particular use case. When you try to extend this though, sometimes it's hard to figure out what resource to put that on. Maybe you put it on encounter, and then that developer still has to go and parse through the location history. So designing it is a challenge. It's good for us to collaborate on those kind of things. So finally, messaging. This is the one-size-fits-all solution, and I mentioned earlier that this is sort of where we arrived at. This is what I got in Giphy when I searched for messaging. That was pretty good. Messaging, if you're not too familiar with FHIR messaging, it's basically just kind of an ad hoc way of defining a whole bundle of resources and an event that gets pushed off to one single endpoint. So the receiving system doesn't necessarily have to know what the event is. For them to make sense of it, they do, but you can just sort of blast things out in very much in a V2 kind of way, encode whatever information implicitly in that event you want. There's not a set list of events to choose from. Lots of pros and cons here. So events are defined ad hoc, but you need to agree with your partner ahead of time on sort of how that works. So if I send you a transfer event and you have no idea what that is, we can't really interoperate until we talk about it. It's good for doing real-time stuff. The problem, and this is true of V2 also, is that if you do have sort of these stateful transitions, and this could be true of operations as well, they need to be processed in order. So again, you don't want to transfer somebody after they've been discharged. It can cause a whole mess, depending on how that receiving system interprets that. Messaging is protocol agnostic. I put this as a pro and a con. So at Redox, we see lots of weird stuff, right? Like just flat files over SFTP. I imagine that there's going to be some EHR vendors who will send us FHIR bundles over SFTP at some point in the future, right? It's just like the nature of development in healthcare, that things are a little bit behind. It's super flexible, but it's also super open. It would be nice, one of the benefits of REST is the uniform interface, so you don't have to code all these different use cases, but messaging sort of doesn't necessarily imply, like there's a RESTful way to receive a message. There's an operation called process message, but you can do it any way you want. And bundles are nice because they let you include sort of all the data that's necessary. GraphQL, tools like that can help make that problem easier to deal with in a RESTful world. So you can sort of say in one statement, these are all the things I need. Bundles give you that sort of for free. But again, using bundles and especially attaching profiles to them can be a little tricky. It's not necessarily, it's just a big array of resources. So it's not necessarily the most intuitive way of structuring the data. That's not to say it's impossible. In V2, profiling is all just like written out. It's just not structured. But in FHIR, you can definitely profile a bundle. You use slicing. There's some examples for FHIR documents that you can copy. And I've heard tell of V2, not V2, but FHIR messaging profiles out there, but none of them really public. Okay, principle number 5. There's weird stuff. So it's not a reason to give up. It's just a reason to be defensive. It's sort of a defensive coding 101. This is JZ, the patron saint of Z segments. Couple laughs, okay. Z segments are the V2 version of extensions. That's a bit of a stretch. But they're sort of custom, locally defined data elements. Usually you can find the right resource and extension to put those into or create your own extension. But they're there and your sort of parser needs to know how to deal with those. Usually they're there because they serve a purpose. So it's not something to ignore either. There are people out there who just break the rules. They just blatantly flaunt even the most basic of the specification. So my principle here is be liberal in what you accept and conservative in what you map. The FHIR version of whatever you're mapping should be pristine and beautiful, even if you have to lose some data elements because they're sort of unreliable. So be aware of those people. Again, having that DataQA pipeline in place can really catch some of these before they get to production. HL7 version 2 has a varies data type, so sort of a abstract class, if you will. OBX5 is the chief offender, so the data type of OBX5 depends on another field in OBX. It's just something to handle in your code. So you could have anything from a quantity to a base 64 encoded PDF as a string. Again, the type of integration you do is going to affect this a lot, but it's something to watch out for. V2 also has this fun idea of explicit nulls. So it's a way of saying this should be deleted, or this is explicitly like not populated. There's a lot of different sort of interpretations of that. It's not very common to do at all in general, but again, remember, like, FHIR is a snapshot. So you're basically taking a picture of a resource at a given time when you exchange it over the wire. You can think of this as the same thing. So if that's there, it's just empty data. If you are receiving empty data and you're not getting an explicit null, it's not something to freak out about. But you might want to just have a conversation with your exchange partner if it's something that's really critical to the workflow. Okay, so principle number 6 is now more about FHIR to V2. Everybody is so excited about FHIR. It's awesome. I love URLs. Sort of what we deal with in the old world are these OIDs. And has anyone seen this before? This big long string of numbers. I paid HL7 $100 to sort of give me a root OID for my company, and I can like come up with all these cool tricks to like build nesting underneath it. But it's so much easier to have like a human readable URL. Like, this is great. But V2 doesn't support this yet. The alternative is just like hack it in there, and you can throw it in there, and like most systems will probably work. It's just a string, so if you're sending an OID already and you put a URL in, probably most people won't care. But conceptually, it's not allowed. FHIR has a resource called naming system node that can help build this crosswalk. So again, this sort of goes more into that documentation and design around your system. If you are using an OID and you want to have a URL associated with it, this is the place to put it. It's just sort of like a really static resource that tells you this is how this thing is referred to across different types of nomenclatures, I guess you'd say. I don't know what unique ID would qualify as, but this here is the United States National Provider Identifier. So providers that can prescribe get an ID universally, and we like to see that come across. It's a very good way to identify them. But in HL7 version 2, you'd mostly see that OID if you see anything at all. Usually it's just a string. Principle number 7, respect the resource. So treat a resource like a first-class citizen. This especially comes into play where the sort of the ID property of a resource would be sent into V2. So I'd recommend putting that into the business identifiers in V2. So in FHIR, you have this separation between ID and identifiers. In V2, there is no such thing. You kind of run into a chicken or the egg problem. So if the thing originated in FHIR, it makes total sense to do that. But if you're pulling something out of V2, turning it into FHIR, and then putting it back again, yeah, there's really some sort of philosophical questions about whether or not you should do that. This is a quote from the FHIR spec. So yeah, all the FHIR people in the room tell you it's okay. So yeah, it's okay. When you should really freak out in mapping stuff back to V2 is when identifiers are not really supported at all. So allergies are communicated over V2, usually over ADT. And yeah, it's pretty basic. Like, it's just sort of a code. There's no identifier for the sort of allergy observation. So if you're trying to line those up with something you'd get from, say, the FHIR API, it can be really difficult. And things don't match. You should kind of look like Beaker here and be freaking out. Because that kills people, right? If you don't get the allergies right. There's a second case where things in V2 have identifiers, but they don't necessarily always get populated. So OBX21 is an example. Again, OBX is observations. This was something added very late in V2. So a lot of the EHRs that send OBXs don't support it. In like most practical aspects, this would map to something like a logical ID or a business identifier, and you could reconstruct and do a crosswalk between FHIR and V2. But I have really yet to see one of these in the real world. So getting that data is a challenge. And then you also sort of have this problem, and I think this might be a transitory issue, but if you've ever been to open.epic and looked at the IDs for some of their resources, they're just kind of these UUIDs. It doesn't necessarily match to what's actually in the system. So sometimes the developer who wrote the FHIR stuff is disconnected from the developer who's working on the V2 stuff, and they might not necessarily share the same philosophy for giving things IDs. So just something to watch out for. Finally, sort of a philosophical topic. Who here's heard of contained resources before? Okay, so a few hands. A contained resource in FHIR is sort of like a nested resource. So every resource that's a domain resource has a contained property, and you can just stick little resources in there. The reason you'd want to use this is if you have something in V2 that doesn't really have enough data to construct or hydrate a valid FHIR resource. So sometimes you'll just get a provider name and that's it. You could give that a random UUID and make it a full-fledged resource, but I don't know. You're kind of cheating the system at that point. One way to approach it is to do a contained resource. The idea behind a contained resource is it only makes sense within the context of another resource. And a really good example of this is location. So again, I just screenshotted some stuff from the FHIR spec. But this is how locations look in, say, a big hospital system. You have buildings, wings, floors, departments, rooms, beds. This is what that gets rendered as in V3, or not V3, V2. It's always PV13, so I got confused. There is room to put more specifiers in here, so you can put ID types and you can sort of put more information in here, but most people just put a string for each of those places. So department, hospital, I don't know what that 3 is. It could just be the room number or something. But you could be building 7 resources and sort of sticking those in your bundle, or you could sort of build them all as contained resources. It's just sort of something you'll want to decide on, try out a little bit, see how the ergonomics of it feel. But something to keep in mind. It can be really good in clarifying lack of data, especially when you don't have IDs to go off of. So definitely something to consider when you're doing V2 to FHIR mapping. Yeah, I had a note on here about OBX in the previous example. There might be cases too where you don't have an identifier, but you have this other plethora of data where you probably should just make a full observation resource, have it be independent, not a contained resource of the whole report. So yeah, something to think about. So I have a little bit of time for questions. Otherwise, I can go back to my demo. I guess I'll start with, what are your questions? Yeah. And we have a mic runner, I think, or other rooms did. But go ahead.
I'm just sort of curious. Can you talk about the sort of practical difference between breaking the patient locations out by resources and the contained resource from a consumer standpoint? How do I know which one to pick?
Yeah.
What's the impact?
So the question was, what are sort of just the practical real-world implications of using a contained resource? Say, for example, for location, from maybe an end-user perspective or in-developer perspective. Really, I think it is more of an implicit declaration that, hey, this thing is not a fully baked resource. If you went back to that EHR system that sent it, and let's say their FHIR roadmap, at some point has locations on it. It's very robust. You wouldn't necessarily expect to find one of those as a resource in the future. That would sort of be my first take on it. Did that kind of get at what you were?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Going back to your allergy example, that kind of hit the spot with me personally. How do you deal just with the way the EMRs publish out allergy medication? As an example, I think like Cerner does AO8 and Epic does, I forgot what it was, but one gives you a patient updated message, the other one actually gives you detailed when allergy is changed. It gives you a more distilled information.
Yeah.
Do you do like two separate mappings? Because patient updated is a huge message. Do you map the entire every resource change?
Yeah. So what I would recommend in that kind of situation is, again, like drill down to the use case. So if you really only care about allergy mapping, I would say if you're going to do a FHIR message, have just an event called allergy update, and only pull the fields you care about. Keep it simple. That other data might be valuable, but you just focus on what you need. Get the patient out, get the allergies out. That answer your question?
Yeah.
Yeah, I would like to respond to your question. One of the practical things to consider, I have completed several V2 to FHIR mappings, is when you map V2 to FHIR concerning the contained, the question you should answer beforehand is if you want to query the separate resources. Because you cannot, for example, if you map OBX segments to observations, if you put it into a diagnostic report, for example, you cannot query the observation results of the original V2 message when you're using container. So it's one of the practical things you have to consider.
Yeah, that's a great point. Just consider the actual FHIR interface implications of it. In the back?
Can you expand a bit on your DataQA pipeline? I imagine at the moment you're using a validate against a FHIR profile. If you do, that's great. If you don't, why not? Would that work?
Yeah, so I'll let you behind the curtain a little bit. The question was expanding on the DataQA pipeline. Do we validate against the FHIR profile? So we got started before FHIR was really a thing. I guess it was a thing, but not like a thing. So we have our own sort of canonical model that we map to, and all of our tooling is built around that. So it is very similar to validating against the FHIR profile. When we receive requests over the API, we'll reject them if they don't meet certain requirements. So a field's required. If a field doesn't map to a specific code set, that's not something we'll necessarily reject a request on. But it will go into a work queue where someone from our team addresses it, pretty quickly. And then we can go back and sort of clean up old requests that were broken, replay them if it's sort of one of these event-based streams, because you want to have everything in order. And then, again, a lot of the stuff is sort of in the coding phase. So we almost have like a unit testing framework built into the application, where the person designing the configuration between the two can build assertions out and sort of say this should go to this code system. We don't expect data to be here ever, even though it's required. You can sort of override the schema, things like that. So if you're strictly building out stuff in FHIR, I would say a FHIR validator would be a great choice, just as maybe not for every production message that goes through in V2, but a subset or something like that. I had the word telemetry up here. That's something that we're sort of a platform, so having that insight into it in real time and building alerts that developers get paged for, makes life a lot easier. Yep, right in front.
Yeah, I have a question. So ADT message, for example, can have allergies, vital signs, whatever, so a huge bunch of information. Do you use some kind of, is there any good way to have some kind of umbrella to link them all together to say, okay, this was the one context, so in case another ADT cancels all the stuff that you will be able to remove everything again?
Yeah, so Great question. So the question was, in ADT, you have a whole bunch of data. You could you have insurances, guarantors, you mentioned allergies. Is there some kind of umbrella where you can put all these things underneath and know, I think sort of like intuitively or deterministically that things should be canceled or things should be removed? The answer is, in short, is no. I think in general, going back to some of those things knowing when there's IDs in the field that you can sort of key off of, you can start to build that logic off of the IDs. But in the case of allergies, you might just be out of luck. You have to sort of take it for what it is. Yep, right in front.
Do you do something smart when going back to the statelessness of things that you talked about, different messages? Do you do something smart there with serialization of on message types, or do you serialize everything on global layer? Do you get what I'm?
Yeah. So the question was about statelessness and just sort of message types to different events, and sort of figuring out what's what. We do map based on event type, but you can override it at sort of any level. So the earlier question about, do you want to just have allergies? We can just say, this feed is giving us an A08, this feed's giving us an A31. Those are different events in ADT, but maybe I'll map them to one event if both of them just giving me allergies. So kind of design it that way. So I think we're at time. I'll be hanging out and we can play with this open source HL7 V2 parser. I hope everybody gets jazzed about V2. Yeah. And follow me on Twitter. I'm working on a little React app that should sort of help people learn V2. It sort of breaks everything down. This is something that I think's been missing for a long time. So this will be free whenever it's done and I figure out how to deploy it. But I'll let everybody know. Thank you.